Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about science, aesthetics, and the crossing of disciplinary boundaries with David Edwards, a Gordon McKay Professor of the Practice of Biomedical Engineering at Harvard University and author of Artscience, Creativity in the Post-Google Generation. David Edwards is the Gordon McKay Professor of the Practice of Biomedical Engineering at Harvard University and the author of Artscience, Creativity in the Post-Google Generation, an exploration of the work of those who cross the boundary between art and science. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
I go to a lot of art installations that claim to deliver some sort of combination of art and science, some crossing over the border of art and science, and I tend to be pretty disappointed by them because it's not so much art integrated with science as art next to science, or some art and then some science kind of not interacting too much. How does that differ from true art science as you describe it?
Well, that's a great observation. I think that it's hard to see art today and not have science integrated in some way, and often when it's done purposefully, it seems artificial. I like to focus on art as well as on science as processes of creative thought that in the minds of innovative people fuse naturally. So I see it as a really general phenomenon that we don't encounter very often in our museums or exhibitions, although I think we might, and I think we might understand art and science better, and certainly innovative processes better. So I guess I would say that right now the area of art science or sci-art is often reduced to technology or science empowering art, new media, for example, and I think it is often also reduced to art communicating science, both of which can be interesting and can be really useful. But I think from my point of view, again, what's fascinating is this fused process, which, again, I'd be happy to talk about.
In the book, you have a lot of great examples of art science as it is done today, but what do you think is the most representative example? What one do you give people and say, this is how you do art science?
Actually, what was interesting to me about the book is that it is, or at least for me, the process of writing the book, is that it brought me into contact with a number of creators living today who are innovating, and they're innovating by fusing art and science, and to the extent that that's happened in my own life, I feel like I understand that better. In terms of it being illustrative and being sort of canonical, I think it's such a elusive concept that it may be hard to do that. But having said all of that, let me give you an example that I feel is really meaningful and maybe easiest to understand. And that's the one that I begin the book with, Diana Dabby, who is a professor at this point at Olin College. Diana is a composer and a music, also a pianist who's performed at Tanglewood and Carnegie Hall and many other places. And back in the 80s, 1980s, was in New York and had gone to the Lincoln Center Library and was flipping through magazines describing the frontier of music, and was intrigued by the fact that everybody who wrote the articles had an engineering degree, and so she was disconcerted by that and came back home and flipped open an encyclopedia to try and understand what, by the way, was it that engineers were all about, and then made this decision that since she wanted to be at the frontier of music, she had better understand science or engineering. And so she, obviously, I'm simplifying, but just to get to the point, she ultimately went back to school, got a PhD in engineering, and ended up actually inventing a new way of composing music based upon chaos theory. And what was really interesting to me about that story, and it's an innovation, which is both an incredible thing to hear. I heard her come and play at Harvard University with a bunch of mathematicians, but also just an incredible human story of a woman. And so here, for me, is the art science to finally answer the question. Diana, to push the boundaries of music, crossed into ultimately a fundamental science, mathematics space. Spent years learning calculus and ultimately very advanced mathematics. And in the process, was able to discover something that nobody had seen before, and came back and innovated in music. And so for me, the really meaningful thing about that is the idea, kind of a profound experience in both a conventionally art and conventionally science space produces innovation.
Now, is this a new phenomenon of our modern day, of these last couple decades? Because it seems to me from the book that art science, as you describe, it's a very modern thing that wasn't going on so much before.
What makes it feel very modern, perhaps contemporary, is that in the process of advancing knowledge over the last, maybe especially the last 10 or 15 years, the information explosion has been so great that specialization has become a huge factor in all of our institutions. And so all of us specialize to move our careers forward, and institutions right now are obviously highly specialized. And so information and knowledge is ultimately developed right now in very specialized categories. The importance of sort of identifying this art science process as a key to innovating is very, very contemporary, only because something is not happening in our institutions today which needs to happen, and we're having trouble innovating precisely at a time when we need to be innovating. In a way, innovation in the way we develop ideas from the time we're very small children is very synthetic, very art science-like. And so in that sense, I think that art science has been going on forever. But I think it's really right now today where much of the development of new ideas is happening institutionally, requires lots of resources. I think that it is increasingly something that's absent institutionally, and so we're finally putting our finger on it as something that we need to develop.
You mentioned that institutions are not doing perhaps all they could to foster this sort of thing. What qualities of institutions get in the way of art science?
There's a natural tendency to specialize, and I think specialization is necessary. I think that what many institutions, and just to speak more specifically, I think universities like Harvard University, where I'm at, but also museums, it could be the Louvre, but also many other kinds of institutions, including, frankly, companies. I think we're all increasingly aware of the fact that we need to be, whether it's through really effective management or more institutional kinds of processes, spaces where both artistic or very aesthetic kinds of thinking and scientific or very analytical kind of thinking, in other words, very hybrid sorts of spaces where ideas that would normally not be encouraged in the more conventional specialized departments is encouraged, where people are freer to develop ideas and is constrained for those ideas to follow kind of conventional paths. So I think that free space in education as well as in obviously industry and in culture is something which we need to do better.
Now tell us about your own efforts to foster art science. The book aside, what else have you done?
I have mostly, and most relevantly, I guess, developed a new innovation center in Paris called the Laboratoire, which opened in October and is in the center of Paris. And we do experiments at the Laboratoire between leading international artists and leading scientists, aiming at encouraging this innovative art science process.
Why Paris, specifically?
I have, for the last decade, lived between Boston and Paris. My wife is French, and at this point I have a French passport. And, there's a couple of things, actually, which I'm not sure if I got into that very much in the book, but ultimately, in the early 2000s, this idea of creating the Laboratoire as a space that could help catalyze innovation in partnership with institutions came up through this dialogue at Harvard University and ultimately through the writing of the book. At the same time, I was, to be really honest, a little bit disillusioned with politics in my own country, and so my wife and I, with 3 little children, felt like maybe we wanted to spend a little time outside of the country, but also maybe much more relevantly, the concept of Laboratoire is a major cultural center sort of required a city with a major cultural industry, and so Paris was a much more obvious place to go. The one other thing I would say is that when I went to Paris in 2005 with this idea and with my family, I spent a lot of time dialoguing with cultural institutions in Paris. And what exists right now, in a way, is a very French kind of organization, although there's an American behind it. At this point, the whole team is French. And it has evolved a lot to be an expression that I think is sort of more natural in Paris. Were the Laboratoire to exist in New York or in Santa Barbara, for that matter, I think it would look different, but it happened in Paris.
What about French culture is especially receptive to such a project as that?
I think it's really interesting in the sense that the Laboratoire is right next to the Louvre and the Palais Royal, and so it's in the center of this city that has a major cultural investment. That investment is pretty significantly in the preservation of a culture that pre-existed my time. And so I think that there's a bit of a complex in France, both a huge pride for a wonderful culture and also a concern that so much of their resources go towards preserving the past and concern about what that means about their future culture. So in a way, the Laboratoire is a sort of subversive organization in the center of that, by virtue of being completely experimental and relatively small and based upon partnership. We've been very welcomed. We have collaborations developing with several of the major French organizations, and the public has been really terrific. I wish I could say we did a really careful study of the public before we opened the Laboratoire. We did not, but there's been a terrific turnout. The media have been great.
Now, what sort of art science projects have you seen go on there in Paris? What are some of the ones you always talk about when people say, what cool stuff have you done over there?
We've done 4 experiments to date. One of them I did with a French designer, Mathieu Lano. We opened with the idea of having a theme, and the theme was intelligence, only because intelligence is such an ambiguous word. And Mathieu, who's a really fine, talented young designer, said he would like to make plants smarter. So I'm not at all a designer, and had done some applied math related to mass transport and so forth. So we developed a filter based upon a plant that just won Invention of the Year with Popular Science and was shown at MoMA at the most recent exhibit on design in the last of mine. Much more far out was an experiment done by Fabrice Hibert, who's a plastic artist, French plastic artist, who worked with Bob Langer, who's an MIT professor, and ultimately his experiment was to provide to the public the experience of being a stem cell becoming a neuron. And his idea ultimately was that if one could fall through a very big hourglass, one might have an experiment tantamount to cellular division. So there ends up being these lovely installations that in principle you could fall through and have this sort of weird feeling of transforming from one state to the next. We have right now, just to finish on that, and maybe even more canonical, a really interesting experiment with French chef Thierry Marx, who's a 2-star Michelin, really interesting French chef. Who does a lot in molecular cuisines, which is a real kind of an art science, art as this aesthetic food experience. A very hot interface right now in the culinary arts is this art science-based molecular gastronomy, and he's the leader in France. And so we did this experiment with a French physicist on who was a leader in colloidal science and developed a new way of eating ultimately. And so right now, if you were to go to the Laboratoire is kind of a restaurant.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like these are the sorts of things that will pull in audiences, viewers, people of interest on a purely aesthetic level, and then it'll get them into the science just by aesthetics. Is that the case?
Well, it's really interesting. I think that is, I think, to some degree the case. I think also we're learning a lot, and when we first started this, we were thinking mostly, as maybe most labs do, about the artist. This space, while we do these art science experiments, is really an art and a design space. So it's really driven by artists and designers who formulate hypotheses with scientists. And so for me, the success of the lab is and was related to the creators being happy. And so we focus a lot on that and doing really interesting things. And we're only now, after 9 months of being open, beginning to understand our public and their reactions, which sounds terrible, but that's kind of what's happened. And I think there has been a range of reactions. I think people are really intrigued. I think there is a general feeling right now today that the world's a very complex place, and entering into an exhibition space that is not reflecting that complexity is there's something false about that. And so I think people are really welcoming this sort of hybrid space, and I think also very interested in, indeed, as you say, seeing science, as an aesthetic endpoint. I think where we are needing to do a lot better and are starting to work much more on that is that if you think about going into a lab, you generally don't really understand much unless you happen to have studied that area. So it tends to be this place of process, which is sort of bewildering unless you have a lot of preparation. And so that's kind of the place we opened up, and we had a lot of reaction where people saying, well, this is all really interesting, maybe, but we'd love to understand more. So we don't curate our shows in any formal way, and we feel like that would not be truthful in a certain way. And so we are creating kind of secondary spaces at the Laboratoire where people can kind of roam and get a deeper appreciation. And so just finally, to answer what you just said, I would love this to be a space where people come and understand science in a more profound way through this sort of art kind of introduction. Having said that, I think it'll be a very ambiguous introduction to science. I think that at least I, as a scientist, have difficulty with art or science museums and science centers where often art is used as a hook to bring people in. I think science is very complex, and it has also a huge need to dialogue within itself, and I think that the science that I would love people to come in contact with through the Laboratoire is that science, which is a very potent human and evolving pursuits.
Would it be at all accurate to call one of the goals, or maybe the chief goal of Artscience, to bring the aesthetics back to science, not only for the viewer, for the observer of science, but for the person doing science as well, for the scientist?
Absolutely. I love that description. Absolutely.
What I wanted to ask about next was to touch back onto the book itself with this notion of idea translation and idea acceleration, and what idea acceleration you're doing there in Paris. But for the listener who hasn't read the book, they won't know what I just said. It was just gibberish. So what is idea translation, first off?
Okay, so idea translation is a way of talking about how we develop ideas. And I think it applies from the mundane to the kinds of ideas, more elaborate ideas that we're just describing right now. And in general, when we develop ideas, we begin with some sort of hypothesis and then analyze a path forward and then spend some time carrying that idea forward or moving along that path, and may wake up one night realizing that our experiment is done. And it may be that we want to become king at the high school prom or something. And it's a complex idea, and how we realize it is not obvious, and so it's kind of full of a number of little experiments. And so we tend to do these experiments, hypothesis-driven experiments with our lives as we develop ideas. And so in the book, I describe a space, kind of a three-dimensional space, which I think of as an idea space where every point in the space is an idea, and as I move away from some origin, that idea has more impact in a certain way. That impact could be economic, or it could be cultural or social, and so depending upon the direction I'm moving in that space. And so moving an idea along is translating that idea, and so my idea of idea translation is idea development that's really carrying an idea from one point, one degree of impact to another degree of impact. And I guess just to put this science in that context, what's really interesting to me about that is that if you then look at how an idea is developed, you end up with this sort of random walk where an idea moves in one direction and then sort of stops, and you have this node, and then it moves in another direction. And those points of reorientation where we wake up in the middle of the night and realize that, well, we need to go in another direction, are the huge moments of innovation and creativity and to come to this point of acceleration. It's where an idea slows down and where suddenly we need to reevaluate. And so there's some sort of an analytical process going on, but there's also this very dreamy process of new hypothesis formulation. And those moments, which are fundamentally art science moments for me, at the one hand, aesthetic, very intuitive, inductive, comfortable with uncertainty moments, and very analytical and able to frame a problem kinds of moments. Those moments are moments that innovators love. They're kind of the most fearful moments of idea development, but they are the core of creativity and innovation. And so the final thing I guess I want to say is that whether coming into one of those moments when you're about to not sleep or coming out of one of those moments are moments of big acceleration. That's the idea acceleration I refer to in the book.
Now, this idea of idea acceleration, it sounds a little like it resembles what we talk about when we colloquially talk about reframing an idea and then getting an aha moment to it. Is that at all accurate?
Yeah, I think that is very much accurate. And the one thing I want to point out is, again, the book talks a lot about process, and that's what I'm still trying to talk a lot about here. And so the eureka kind of events, which there has been a lot written about, is interesting to me and relevant to the book as a process, as this process which is not quite as extraordinary as Archimedes jumping out of the bath and running naked. It's a very human thing, and it's probably happening in a lot of little eureka moments, but it is absolutely the acceleration I'm talking about.
Now, when you were writing the book Artscience, how did you go about finding these art scientists? Because there's a bunch of them in the book, but how do you locate art scientists before the term is really defined?
Well, it's a really interesting question, and so it began as it was a little cyclone kind of thing, and so it happened that there was this conversation I might have talked about in this interview at Harvard University, looking at how do we integrate the university and get many different kinds of disciplines working together. I noticed that basically there were lots of different disciplines, but they never crossed this art science interface. I, having an interest in that area, but never having thought of myself as an artist scientist, looked for a few people who could understand that, and so we began to talk. And so we just had these conversations that we began to tape. We were all really interested in the commonality of our experience. So you'll notice that about 40% or 30% of the people have a Harvard connection. And so as we talked, we began to say, well, what about person X or person Y? And as I spent a lot of time in Europe, and so I began to then, I was so sort of taken by this whole notion that it ended up coming up in conversations. And so the people who are in the book are sort of it's a very ad hoc mixture of people. It could have been any 11 people, I think, who are very creative in working at this art. There's a lot of people, but it happened to be 11 real people and who happen to associate with my life. And I was particularly interested in focusing on them only because there was something very non-myth-making about the stories that we ultimately told.
I talk to a lot of people on this show with an interest in the convergence or even just the mixture of humanities and sciences. And some of them think that for the humanities, the only direction forward is to merge with the sciences. And I wondered if, to your mind, is art science the only way to go for art to develop or even for science to develop? Will they both veer toward art science? Will they converge on art science? Or is it more of a third path?
It's more the latter. I think I'm going to sort of challenge that formulation and say that I think that the art science space, if you can call it that, is systemic. So I think it's a systemic reality that by virtue of our need to divide the world up into the artists and the scientists, which maybe was never a very good idea, has produced this need of what seems like a third area. But I think it's incredibly human, really leading, that sounds wrong, but very creative people, whether they're artists or scientists or bankers, for that matter, tend to practice art science. So I'm more skeptical of art science as a third way, as a kind of discipline in itself. And you'll notice that everybody I describe in the book had real specialization in one way or another. It's sort of hard to study to become an art scientist. But I think it is a recognition of a general creative principle that does make artists and scientists brothers and sisters in a way, and kind of is more of a unification principle than a discipline.
Someone reading this book could think of art science and art science as three distinct camps, but are you more of the mind that art and science form a bit of a continuum, something that you can move back and forth on in a continuous rather than discrete way?
Absolutely, and I maybe before I fully respond to that, I should finish responding to your first question, which is sort of implied in your second, and say that I think, and having also myself studied in much more theoretical science areas, I completely applaud and admire artists and scientists who are, in a way that we kind of all understand, working in very pure spaces. We're doing an experiment in the fall with Ryoji Ikeda, who's a really fine Japanese artist, and is incredibly sort of polluted by lots of non-aesthetic ways of things. So anyway, I think that that's totally fabulous. So just having said that, then I think there are extremes of the continuum, but ultimately I do, and I think that there's just this real interest, which is clearly something we've seen at the Laboratoire, for artists and scientists and creative people in general to move between the arts as we conventionally think of them and the sciences. I think it's very human and it's very natural, and so I think art science does help to establish the continuum.
Now, we're running a little bit low on time, but I want to ask you one more thing that I really want to know. What do you see in the future of art science? How important do you see it being? What developments do you see possibly coming from art scientists?
Mostly, I think the most interesting outcome is an institutional one. I think we're at a real, maybe everybody does in their own generation, but I think that we are in a certain crisis point institutionally, in the sense that we have just come from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years where institutions were mostly based upon sort of information as a primary value. It's obviously true at universities where we were information providers, but it's also true in a real way in terms of how we make museums and so forth. And suddenly, by virtue of being in a world where information is, I don't want to say it's in excess, but there's a lot more information, and we're much less information deprived, the notion of a university as an information provider fundamentally, or as of a museum, is being defined by its sort of information content, is sort of invalidated. And so there's a real search institutionally in education and culture and in industry to understand the new value basis, and I think there's an increasing recognition that it's fundamentally related to innovation. And so I think art science, to answer your question, can be, and I think it will be, a real interesting and important key to understanding how do we reorient our institutions to respond to the conditions of today. So I would hope that more of us think about ourselves as art scientists tomorrow than we do today.
One more time, the book is Artscience, Creativity in the Post-Google Generation. David Edwards, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, Ben Althouse, that's BenAlthouse.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit ColwynMarshallRadio.com.